My name is Ashley Palmer, and I'm the Conservation Education Specialist with the Northern Virginia Soil and Water Conservation District. Thank you for joining us again for another webinar. We're really happy to bring these to you every week with different interesting topics that are going to be really helpful as we get more into gardening and into the rest of the summer when we need to be doing a lot of things outside. This webinar is going to be recorded, and it's going to be available both on Facebook and on our website. You're muted right now, so that way none of our feeds interact with each other and create any of those annoying vibrating sounds that we've had on a couple of webinars. If you have any questions at any time, you can go ahead and put those into the chat box, and I'll address them as soon as I get the chance. Today we're going to be learning how to compost your food waste. We'll be talking about basics of composting, different kinds of composting that you can do both outside and inside, and some of the best practices that you can use while you're preparing to compost. Here's my introductory slide. I do work for the Northern Virginia Soil and Water Conservation District. I'm our Conservation Education Specialist, and my role is to manage our social media, our website, our education programs, and our outreach programs. I have both a Master's and a Bachelor's of Science in Environmental Science from George Mason University. I just graduated recently. I graduated actually in December with my Master's, so I'm still riding on that high. And the question I get from, I think, every student I've ever presented to are, what kind of pets do you have? So I always share that I have a cat, I have a turtle, I have a hermit crab who normally lives in our office, 3 honeybee hives with about 100,000 honeybees, and a worm composting bin, which is also living in our office right now. I'd like to start by just saying that we are talking about composting today because we have our Sustainable Garden Tour going on this month, all of June. Now, the garden tour in other years has been a single-day event where we will have one afternoon available to go and visit between 8 to 10 different sites and look at all of the practices that they do in their gardens and get our own ideas for what we can do at home. And this year, of course, with social distancing, that was a little bit harder to manage. But with the help of all of our amazing garden tour hosts this year, including some that are on this webinar now, we were able to bring you the Sustainable Garden Tour this year virtually. So this month, you may have noticed that our webinars are focusing on gardens. Last week, we talked about soil. Today we're talking about composting. Next week we'll be talking about rain gardens, and then the week after that we'll have an interactive garden tour. So if you haven't had the opportunity yet to visit our Sustainable Garden Tour, please check out our website at www.fairfaxcounty.gov/soil-water-conservation/sustainable-garden-tour. It's a little bit of a long URL, but I can also provide that to you. And on there, you'll see the calendar for when we're releasing our tours, as well as some of the tours that have already been released. So firstly, we can't talk about best ways to compost without talking about what compost really is. And the definition for compost is going to change a little bit, depending on who you talk to. But it's essentially just food and yard waste that's broken down over time. It's a combination of living microbes and dead organic matter. So it's going to have leaves, it's going to have vegetable peels, it's going to have leftovers from your plate, and it's going to be very high in carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus. And these are some of the many nutrients that plants need to grow. But what's nice about compost is that since things are breaking down in place, those nutrients are also kept in place. So instead of those being carried away in fertilizer by rain or by wind, they're going to stay in place. So compost is a very special sort of soil amendment that's going to provide those nutrients to the plants in a more effective way. So why compost? That's a really big question because we get an awful lot out of it. Firstly, it helps with waste reduction, particularly right now when we're still in the midst of a pandemic. You've probably noticed that we're having a lot more waste in our homes than we were expecting. I know I, for one, am making a lot more trash than I thought I would. We're not going to the same places that we used to where we would throw away trash there. I'm not eating in the cafeteria at work. where I would dispose of all of my waste in that location instead of bringing it home. And a lot of the time, the different companies and different groups that are dealing with our waste can sometimes be overwhelmed by the amount that we're making. So by composting, you're reducing the amount of waste that's going into landfills, which are quickly filling up even in the best of circumstances. You're also creating a useful product. So the compost that you create is going to be used in gardening, in landscaping, with your houseplants. You can use it any place that you would traditionally use fertilizer, and sometimes even in additional other better places. For example, you might not want to use a lot of fertilizers inside because they have other chemicals in them, and if you have a cat like me, they tend to get into the soil of any plant that you put in your house. So when you use compost instead, you know that's more of a natural thing that you've made. You know exactly what goes into it, and you would feel more comfortable putting it on even the indoor plants that your cats might like, for example. Composting is environmental stewardship. Environmental stewardship in this case is any of those green practices that you're taking to promote behaviors that protect the environment. So by composting and by reducing waste and by reusing what you already have, you're promoting environmental stewardship. It's also a very good educational experience. When I talk a little bit later about my compost bin for worms, I'll tell you a little bit more about how I take it into schools. But this is a really good opportunity, particularly for children, to learn about what's going on and how things break down naturally. We don't often see that. We mostly live in environments where we rake up our leaves every time they fall, we put them in bags, somebody takes them away, but we're not really sure what happens to them. And unless you can see that close up, it's hard for you to make the connections that that kind of waste would have on the environment. I can also say that as an adult, it's a very rewarding educational experience for me to see how my worms are breaking down the food that I feed them. I find it very fascinating. And finally, you might want to compost because you can save a lot of money by doing it. If you're someone who normally buys fertilizer for your veggies or for any of your beautiful ornamental plants or any of the natives you may have, you could save money by using compost instead. You make free fertilizer using food scraps that you would just throw away anyway, and it makes a really great product for your garden. So I'm going to first talk about outdoor composting before I talk about indoor composting. A lot of people are very familiar with outdoor composting, so I find that this is a great place to start. There are a couple different ways that you can do outdoor composting, and basically the idea is just the different container that you might use. So a holding unit is more of a place where you just throw away your excess food waste and your leaves, and you just wait. It'll become compost eventually. Turning units are more of an organized process where you're turning and rotating that compost to create the material. And an enclosed bin is set up so that you can have traditional outdoor composting, but it'll be a little bit more protected from the elements and any pests you may be concerned about. So let's look at each one a little bit more closely. Firstly, a compost holding unit. This is what a lot of people think of when they think of composting, just kind of a place to toss that extra waste. It is very low maintenance and it can be very cheap to build. You can build it from cinder blocks, you can build it from pieces of fence, wooden pallets, any kind of wire fencing that you may have, or any other materials that you have sitting around. Maybe you took down a tree recently and you're looking for something to do with those logs. This is something that you could do. And this is really set up not so much to generate compost, but instead to get rid of that waste. This is going to take a really long time to break down. We'll talk about some more of those factors later, but essentially here you're not turning things around, you just let it sit. So it's not getting quite as much oxygen as there as you would like to have a really quick turnaround on your compost. So this is one of those nice set it and leave it bins, and then you come back a year later and it's got what you need. What's also nice is that because you have it protected by these walls and because it's taking a little bit longer to break down, you have fewer pests with this sort of setup. This is an example of a compost turning unit. So it's essentially just like the holding units, but there's a couple side by side, and then you can see that you have that access there in front. Now this is one that was made out of wood. You can build them from reclaimed pallets if you're still trying to stay pretty economical, or you can build them out of any other material that's going to hold the compost in place. But what's nice about this one is that it has doors in the front, so you can get easier access to the compost. And here you're going to have it break down just like you did in the original holding unit, but it's also going to have the added benefit of you turning it. So when you turn it, you're putting a lot of oxygen in there, and the microbes that are inside the compost are going to be able to use that to break down the material in the compost even faster. So essentially you can put it in one bin, you can wait till it fills all the way or halfway, whatever you like, turn it, rotate it, move it over, and then by the time it's in the third bin, it'll have already broken down enough that you could use it or almost use it, and you can begin a new batch of compost in the first bin. These are examples of compost enclosed bins. These are a really good option for when you're looking for outdoor composting, but you have a smaller area or you're particularly concerned about pests. These you can also build at home if you're looking again for that economical option, or you can purchase them from a lot of home and garden centers. I believe I saw them at both Lowe's and Home Depot this year, and both of those places do deliver as well. There's also a lot of garden centers, probably near you. We've got a lot of them in Northern Virginia and a lot in Fairfax County. So you can take a look at what they offer and what might be a really good fit for you. You can also just build one at home with a garbage can. And so for that, you would just need to drill aeration holes all around the bin. So that way there's still enough air getting inside that everything can break down a little faster. All of these holes are pretty small, so it's going to be really difficult for rodents or other pests to get in there and eat the scraps. And this is also nice because you can put it a little closer to your home, or you can kind of disguise it in your decor. So if you have an HOA that's not really happy about you having a compost pile out back, this might be a good option. The Northern Virginia Soil and Water Conservation District does composting workshops. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to offer one for a little while, simply because we haven't been able to get close enough to each other to build our compost bins. But the bins that we have are large pickle barrels. They're 55-gallon pickle barrels that you build a wooden stand for, so they're elevated and they can turn, and they have aerated holes like this as well. So this is the kind of compost bin that I would recommend if you're getting kind of new to composting and you wanted to make your product a little bit faster. So here are my tips and tricks and keys to success with outdoor composting. The 4 big things you're going to need are a proper C/N ratio, and that's the amount of carbon to the amount of nitrogen that's in your compost, proper moisture and oxygen in your compost, heat, and using the appropriate material size. Before I move anywhere else, I do want to say, you can put a pile of leaves, kitchen waste, grass clippings in a pile and it will decompose, I promise you that. But this is not really a webinar where I'm teaching you how to throw your kitchen waste into a pile. We're trying to see how can we make that compost a little bit faster? How can we build this product and get it out there so that way we can have it for our gardens? So don't worry about doing it wrong. You can put any of this outside and don't worry, the composting will happen. But if you're trying to speed it up a little bit, these are some ideas. Firstly, we want to keep a really good carbon to nitrogen ratio, and that's the ratio of carbon to nitrogen in the compost materials. A ratio of at least 14:1 is best. I can't tell you how to get a perfect ratio of 14:1. That's actually very tricky, but what this really turns out to mean is a ratio of brown waste, so old leaves, brown leaves, wood chips, paper scraps, paper towels, to greens, which are the kitchen waste and the grass clippings and green leaves, and just getting a good ratio of those. And actually the next slide will describe that a little bit better. We also want to look at the material size that we're using. When we have smaller pieces, you're going to have faster decomposition. The idea behind that is that with each smaller piece, you have a higher surface area compared to the volume of the piece. And the more surface area there is, the more room there are for all of the organisms to start breaking it down, all the fungus, all of the little bacteria that's in your pile, worms if you're lucky. So smaller pieces are going to lead to faster decomposition. We're also looking for proper moisture. So the water is going to help those organisms as well. They do need some water to survive. So if this is in a really, really dry environment, you're going to have fewer microbes and slower breakdown. So it should be a little wet, but not too wet. It should be kind of spongy. It should be kind of squishy, but it shouldn't ever be sopping wet. And the good news is that if it is, you can just wait for it to dry for a while, or you can add more browns. So essentially the browns are going to make it drier. The paper, the brown leaves, the wood chips, the paper towels. And the greens are going to make it wetter. And that makes sense because when we talk about greens, we're looking at all of those kitchen wastes, the fruits and vegetables that go in, and they have a very high water content. So depending on if you need a little bit more or a little bit less water, you can think about what to add a little bit more of. And you want to turn it pretty consistently to keep it oxygenated, which is again going to help those microorganisms. One way to do that is if you have a bin with a door in front, you can remove the door and then use a shovel to kind of turn it around. If you're feeling really adventurous and you have like a garbage can with holes in it and that's your composter, you could pick it up and shake it around. That's another option. But you just want to make sure that it's getting turned and you're getting some oxygen in there. Also, more holes will help to aerate it. You also want to have a pretty hot compost pile. The hotter the pile, the faster the decomposition. Essentially, the hotter it is, the more you're going to activate that microbial activity and it's going to start to break it down faster. Hot piles also kill weeds. So you can throw your lawn clippings in there without worrying about having dandelions pop in your compost pile as long as it's hot enough. So it's important to have your compost pile at least a little bit in the sun. I'm not saying it has to be on your driveway, right there in the middle where it's going to get really hot, but it should be in a place that at least gets some partial sun. And then here's some more information about getting the carbon and nitrogen balance right. So again, I can't tell you that it's 3 apples to 1 cup paper shreds or anything like that. But you want to have about 1/3 to 1/2 of the things that you put in your compost pile to be greens. Those are, again, your kitchen scraps, your grass blades. In this picture, the greens are, I believe, that could have been lettuce and the apples. And I think there's a head of cabbage up there we are cutting off the top of. And then you want about 1/2 to 2/3 browns. Those are your dry leaves, your shredded paper, your sawdust, anything like paper towels or paper plates. All of that is going to be your browns. And then in this picture, it's all of those brown leaves. So you're just trying to have a good mix of those two things. And this is my little one-pager guide. I'm going to go ahead and leave this slide up for a little bit in case you would like to take a screenshot. And this is also a great time to ask any questions that you may have about composting outdoors, if you have any questions about that. And then this just sums up what I've been talking about in this first part of the webinar. And if you would also like a copy of this, I can send it to you in PDF form if you send me an email at ashley.palmer@fairfaxcounty.gov, and I'll have my email available at the end as well. So I'm going to leave it just a second and see if anybody has any questions. Alrighty, so if not, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about indoor composting. So when you talk about composting indoors, there's 2 different big tools that you can use. You can use a garbage can bioreactor. I'm going to tell you it's basically the same thing as the outside garbage can, but with fewer holes. Or you could use a worm composting bin. In the garbage can bioreactor, it's not quite as messy as that little icon makes it seem. It looks a lot like the white one over here to the side, and that is decomposition performed by the microorganisms and the heat, and it's set up basically the same way as the outside composting bin. And then a worm composting bin has decomposition that is performed by the microorganisms and also by redworms. And the worms help to speed everything up because they do some of the composting inside their bodies for you. I'll talk a little bit about that too. I got a great question about composting meat scraps. We can't compost any meats. There's a couple other things that you shouldn't compost. I'll go ahead and I'll share those with you a little bit later, but essentially you only want to put in the greens and the browns. So you can put in things like coffee grounds, you can put in fruits, vegetables, you can put in shredded paper, you could put in paper plates that you're done eating with when you're done with your barbecue. You could put in all kinds of things like that, but you don't want to put in any meat, any dairy, or any oils. So you don't want to put in basically any of those fats. Those things are very difficult for the organisms in your compost to break down. This is a picture, albeit a fuzzy picture, of a garbage can bioreactor. So it's a very small scale indoor composting unit for families. And you take a smaller trash can and you nest it inside of a larger trash can. So the larger trash can doesn't have any holes, and the trash can on the inside does have holes on the sides. So that allows the air to go into the compost, but it makes sure that you're not going to get anything that might leak out of the compost into your home. These are really good options for people who don't have an awful lot of yard space. We're talking about some of the people who might have condos or apartments or townhomes that don't have a lot of yard space. This is also something that you could put into your garage. So that way, middle of winter, we got a foot of snow on the ground and you don't have to go outside to get rid of your food waste. This is an option there. What's also nice here is that it allows for the collection of something called compost tea. Compost tea is a very nice name for the excess liquid that's going to come out of your compost. So if it is a little bit too wet, and then even if it's not too wet, even if it's still spongy like it's supposed to be, over time there's going to be this leachate, this material that leaks out this extra liquid. When you have your compost outside, that's just going to go into the ground, not be a big worry. But inside, it's going to go to the bottom of this can. You can actually collect that, and it is a very, very nutrient-rich water. So you can take it and dilute it 1 to 5 or 1 to 10 with water, and you can pour that over your plants. Particularly your indoor plants would do very well with the extra nutrients that come off of that. And then we get to worm composting. Worm composting is so cool, it has its own name. It's called vermicomposting, and vermi being from the Latin word for worm. So in this type of composting, we use worms to recycle food scraps and other organic material into valuable compost. And here's a little bit more on how that happens. So inside the bin, the worms eat the food scraps, and then as they digest it and it goes through their body, they break it down. But they don't have very efficient bodies, so as they're breaking it down, they don't take all the nutrients out of it. So essentially, they've done the composting for you. They squish it down, they make it smaller, they keep the nutrients. The compost then exits the worm as waste, and you can use that compost as a fertilizer on your plants just like you would traditional compost, but it breaks down much faster. When you have an outdoor compost pile, it can take weeks or sometimes months for that to break down. If you have a worm bin, I've never put any piece of food into the worm bin that lasts longer than 2 weeks. So your mileage may vary, but they break it down very quickly. And so here are some keys to success with worm composting. There's a really beautiful worm composter here, this image to the left, which is red and it has a little spout to get all that excess water out the bottom. This looks really nice. You can buy these from Amazon, lots of other online retailers, or sometimes you can find them in home improvement stores like Lowe's and Home Depot or at other garden centers. They tend to be a little bit more expensive. I am going to have on the next page a more economical option, which is the one that I use, and I just use 2 plastic bins for these guys. But they have a very similar tips and tricks as if you were doing it outside. For the keys to success here, we talk about material layering, using not only the right materials, but in the right spot, using the right worms, and again, providing heat and appropriate drainage if you have excess water. So first, with these guys, we need to look at where they're going to live and what they're going to eat. So with the worms, because we do have organisms in there, the browns, the cardboard, and the paper are not going to be eaten by the worms, but they are going to be the bedding layer for them to live in. And then they have a food layer to snack on, which are going to be those greens. So you will find with worm composting that the greens are going to break down a lot faster than the browns because they don't eat the browns quite as often as they eat the greens. But you want to try and have levels of those so that they have places to live and things and places to eat. We want to provide proper drainage. If you have extra water in your compost pile and you give it long enough outside, it's going to eventually evaporate and it's going to drain either it's going to evaporate or it's going to drain into the ground. Here where you've got these worms inside, you want to make sure that you are not going to have too much water in there because desaturated conditions will kill the worms. It'll be impossible for them to live in that environment. So worm composting containers have a lower tray that collects the leachate. So in this picture here, hoping you can see my icon, here is the tray where we're going to collect that extra compost tea. Again, very nutrient rich, very good to use. But that's down here, and then we're going to have a tray probably of greens, bedding, and more greens for the worms. And then you have to have the right worms. So when I talk about worm composting, a lot of people imagine the big earthworms that we find in our yard or the ones that we see on the sidewalk after a rainstorm. But those guys actually live in very different places than these worms do. So those earthworms normally live much deeper underground, and they're not used to breaking down food in the same way that we want these worms to. So these worms are called red wigglers, and they are very cheap. I think the last time I got them, they were about $10 for a pound of worms. So that's quite a lot of worms, and you don't need all that many to get your compost bin started because don't worry, they will make more worms. So you shouldn't use earthworms from the garden. You should use red wigglers. I had a lot of luck with a place called Jim's Worm Farm, but there are a lot of places where you can get red wigglers over the internet very cheaply, and they'll ship them to your home. And then here we need to pay attention to heat as well. Now it's not really like outside where it's hotter is better. The worms will take care of it regardless. But they do best in temperatures between around 55 to 85, which is essentially the temperature you're going to keep your home. Probably right in the middle of that range actually. So that's why they do really well indoors. They can also be kept outside over the summer. If it's too hot, if it's above that range I just gave, they should still be fine. But if it's too cold, they will die. Red wigglers cannot survive our cold winters unprotected. So they can be out on your porch all summer, all spring, all fall if you like. Over winter, you need to either bring them inside or wrap them in insulation. Sorry about that, we skipped a little bit. So we also have a brochure for worm composting and a general how-to for setting up your own worm compost bin. So I'll stay on this slide for a little bit in case anyone wanted to take a screenshot again, and then I'll move to the next slide, which is the other side of this composting guide. And then here's where it has some of those notes about what you can feed them. Ideally, you should be able to feed your worms or any compost pile, tons of fruits, tons of veggies, coffee grounds are good, tea bags are good. With worms, you have to give them citrus fruits, onions, and starchy foods in moderation. Essentially, you can't feed them only potatoes, or only lemons, or only onions, but those things are things that can be tossed into your outside compost bin, no problem. And then you should never put into any compost bin meats, oil, or dairy. So no chicken, no yogurt, in case you wanted to put that in your bin, none of that, and no oils. So if you were cooking and you have oil scraps, this is not the way to dispose of those. Particularly for the worms, you don't want to give them spicy foods either. They have a rather delicate palate, and you don't want to dispose of your animal waste in there. You can dispose of your animal waste in a traditional compost pile, one that's outside. So if your dog normally goes in the yard and you've been looking for a place to get rid of that, you want to scoop it up and put that in your pile, that's an option. It doesn't get rid of the odor, but it will break it down. And so here's the other side of that again if you wanted to take a screenshot, or if you would like a copy of this, I'll have my email at the end of the PowerPoint. You can just let me know. This is the same setup that I have for my worm compost bin. So you need 2 plastic bins. You can get them pretty cheaply. And then the other things that are pictured here is you need the drill to drill the holes in the bin. Those little white rods underneath the drill are the posts to elevate the bins from each other. And then you need your food scraps, your worms, and your browns. So in this case, paper. So for one of the bins, you drill holes all over it, tons of holes. Drills holes for drainage, holes for extra air to go through, and then you put the bin with holes in it into the bin without holes in it, and you put it up on those stilts so that way it's still not sitting in extra water. And then the extra water that's going to be at the bottom is going to be the compost tea, and then you'd make the layers of the bedding and food waste, add your worms, and they will take care of the rest. Once you have a setup like this, it's very easy to care for. You just add the food whenever you have it, essentially. So whenever you have those kitchen scraps, you can use those. Just put them in there and the worms will eat it up. We have our worm composting bin actually at our office at the Harity building. And there are a lot of people that work on my floor who don't even know that the worms are there because I keep them in our kitchenette and I keep them tucked away and they don't have any odor at all. So a lot of people don't even know that they're there. They're usually fascinated when it's time for me to feed them. And I did get a question from Tess, and she asks, can your compost pile get too hot? Your compost pile, if it's outside, cannot get too hot. The only thing that it's going to do is it's going to cause more breakdown. It will kill some more of those weed seeds. I know a couple people who have been happy to see pumpkins or other things like that sprout from their compost pile. Those might also be killed by the heat, but it's not going to damage the compost. And then Willie asks, is it okay to feed the worms veggies that are going bad? And the answer to that is absolutely. I don't feed them any of the veggies that I would eat. I paid good money for those veggies from the market. I want those. But I do feed them those strawberries that got a little moldy because I forgot that they were in the back of the drawer, or I feed them the peels from the oranges and peels from the bananas. So you don't need to feed them any of the food that's still quote unquote good. They'll eat something mushy, they'll eat something moldy. If anything, the extra fungus that's breaking anything down that's moldy is going to increase decomposition in your bin. Because it is worms breaking it down, but it's still the other organisms that are in there as well that are going to help to break it down. So even after all this, how do you get started composting? First, you learn. This was kind of a quick and easy webinar about some tips and tricks on how to get started composting, but I can't say that I'm the only person who's got great advice for you. So I recommend that you look up other compost workshops or presentations. And in fact, the Virginia Cooperative Extension has a really great composting webinar series. And they talk about even the difference between composting in agriculture versus composting in your backyard, different tips and tricks regarding temperatures and how to get at the right temperature. So Tess, if you wanted to look into that to learn a little bit more about heat, you could do that. There's this link here. And then once this is released online as well, you'll be able to follow that link. I also recommend that you just research a little bit more about composting. If you are new to composting, you're not sure at all where to start. These links from the EPA and Cornell University are great places to start. They start where I did with what is composting, but they also talk a little bit about why composting is important and how you can do it at home, what kind of value it brings, and different things that you might need to know to get started if you didn't already have one. And if you do already have a compost bin and you're just trying to look at ways to improve your composting, they also have some great resources there. Fairfax County is also a very good resource. So once you've learned everything and you're ready to start, you're ready to get started, then it's time for you to go ahead and get some supplies. And go ahead and get started. So with Fairfax County, they have this link here, which leads to more information about composting in Fairfax County, which is really good information if you're about to get started. And the Soil and Water Conservation District has published a handbook called You and Your Land. And You and Your Land is a guide for not only composting, but for putting in rain gardens, for dealing with erosion, for dealing with drainage concerns. This is a really great guide to be familiar with, particularly if you see us a lot at our webinars, or you have a lot of questions about what's going on your property. So these are really great resources for learning more, for getting supplies, and for getting ready. So the summary here that I want you to take away is that composting is easy and it's good for the environment. When you do outdoor composting, it takes up more space, but it takes a lot less work. You can kind of just throw it out there and wait. It's going to break down eventually. Indoor composting requires very little space and is odorless, but you have to do it at least partially indoors. And you have to be a little bit more careful about the amount of greens to the amount of browns that you're putting in there. And I hope that you've also taken away that the Northern Virginia Soil and Water Conservation District is a great resource for learning about composting. If you have any particular questions about composting that I didn't address here, I'm going to go ahead and take some questions, but you will also have my email, so you can let me know if you have any questions. This is my contact information. Again, I'm Ashley Palmer, the Conservation Education Specialist at the Soil and Water Conservation District. My phone number at my office is 703-324-1423, and my email address is ashley.palmer@fairfaxcounty.gov. And then this is our website here in case you want to learn a little bit more. If you'd like a copy of the Worm Composting Guide or the Traditional Composting Guide, you can go ahead and send me an email, and I'll go ahead and share that with you. Does anyone have any questions at all about composting? While we're thinking about other questions we may have, this isn't the first time I've done this presentation, so I've collected some questions in case we were interested in seeing a little bit more about what's going on there. So here are some common questions that I usually get about composting. How long does it take? And that depends on what you want to use it for. If you want to use it as mulch, it doesn't have to be broken down all the way. You can use it almost immediately. If you just have a pile of leaves, you should expect that to take a year. And the worm bin, if you're putting them in a large bin, is a little bit longer. I actually meant to write 6 weeks, not 6 months, my apologies. So it's a lot quicker in the worm bin. So it doesn't take very long if you're active with your composting. If you let it sit, it's going to happen anyway. How do you know when the compost is finished? Ideally, you shouldn't be able to tell anything apart inside the compost. If you look and you can see it's an apple core, it's not quite done yet. And it'll smell like soil. It won't really smell like anything that you've put in there. How often do you have to turn the pile? The more you turn it, The more you aerate it, the more air those microbes get, and the quicker you get your compost. If you use compost, do you still need fertilizer? Generally, no, because the compost is going to have all those same kinds of nutrients in there. But if you're using a crop that requires a burst of nitrogen or a particular material that's not included in the compost, you may want to put a little bit extra in there. How do you keep pests away? And this is the biggest reason why we don't include that meat and dairy. Because honestly, everything will break down eventually, but you really don't want to open up your composting bin and then you see there's a bunch of mice in there. So you don't want to put meat and dairy in there. You don't want to put cooked foods in there. And then if you're indoors, you don't leave those food scraps exposed to the air because then flies or gnats that come inside may smell it. So if you put in some food scraps, just go ahead and cover them with a little bit of paper. Will there be leachate? And this is the compost tea that I mentioned. So when you compost outside, the compost tea is just going to go naturally into the ground. Like this bin here has no place to catch it. It's just going to go into the ground. But if you're using it in containers, you can collect it and you can use it on your plants. And will it smell bad? Generally, no. If it does smell bad, there's something we need to fix a little bit of. It could be too wet. It might not have enough oxygen. So in that case, I usually add more dries, more browns. So you could add more paper or you could add more scraps of wood or things like that. That would go in there. And then I get some worm questions. These are good. You don't have to add worms to your compost pile. It happens naturally outdoors without worms. But if you get worms in your compost pile, they will break it down a little faster for you. So that's always nice to find. Can I add coffee grounds to my compost? Yes, if you add them to your compost, it'll attract worms, and it's also good for worm composting. What's interesting about the worms is they don't have any teeth, and it's really hard for them to break down food. So they sometimes take in gritty things like coffee grounds or ground up eggshells, and they stay in their gizzard, and they use that to break down some of the food. So providing them with a little bit of coffee grounds is going to help them break down your food even a little faster. Do I need to add worms to my compost pile? Oh, that's a repeat question. Sorry about that. Can worms bite? No, they don't have any teeth and they can't bite you. And then I sometimes do this activity in schools where then I give each of the students a worm to hold and we talk about them and they ask me what is the yellow liquid that's coming out of the worms. The worms didn't pee on you. They just release a lot of fluid. So you get a lot of fluid when you do worm composting. It's very nutritious for plants. And then the reason that we use these red wigglers instead of earthworms are like I mentioned here. Red wigglers are very small and they live in the top 6 inches of soil and they're used in composting. They are used in composting most often because they live in that upper soil level where if you were in last week's webinar, you remember it's called the organic layer. So there's a lot of organic material for them to break down there. These earthworms or night crawlers are larger and they're several feet deep and they create tunnels that aerate the soil, but they don't break down a lot of materials and certainly not very quickly. And then the last question, which is perhaps the most common question I get asked, is what happens if you cut a worm in half? Some worms can regenerate tails, but not heads. So unfortunately, you're usually left with 2 halves of a dead worm. And those are all the questions that I normally get. If anyone has any other questions, I'd be happy to address those. And if you need any of those resources, please let me know and I can also get those to you. I hope that you're able to join us next week as well. We'll be talking about rain gardens with Maria Harwood.